Hello, this is Edith Neumeyer, and I'm the author of the book The Mystery of Adam. I will kind of finish today looking at a historical development of marriage and the role of the man and the woman, or the husband and the wife. I want to look today a little bit at the development of marriage in the last, let's say, 100 years. I know a lot of churches want to push this idea that these roles that we call traditional roles of the husband and the wife um, are biblical, but nothing is further from the truth. I have already shown throughout history that it was a cultural determination or a cultural expectations of how the man and the woman had to react, um, and that this expectation was kind of incorporated into the church and never questioned, even in recent times. About 100 years ago, in our culture, in our society, women received equal rights with men. And that was a very remarkable because, for the first time, society looked at the role of women, especially women, in a different way. All of a sudden, women were, on paper, considered equal with men. However, of course, we know that this equality was not always acted out upon. And so, even today, women in the workplace still don't have total equal rights. I would think that men many times still make more money than women. And women are still very tied to the traditional roles of what they're supposed to be doing in terms of staying home and raising children. Now, I believe that women should stay home with their babies, with their children, at least the first, I would say, about 3 years, and then it would be an okay thing, to have a babysitter and go back to work. 3 years is not a long time to be out of a profession, or at least do part-time when you have little kids. However, I believe that is an ideal. That is not something that the Bible told us from the beginning, that women should stay home and take care of the children. I believe every family has to make that decision. I want to remind you that 100 years ago, that men and women worked side by side, and I'm talking about the common folks. I'm not talking about the high society or the upper middle class people that had money and could afford to have servants, and women could actually afford to stay home and not have to work. In the working class family, women always had to work. Okay, think about back to the time of the farmers and the ranchers here in this country. Women had to work just as hard as the husband. Yes, they did more the hard, the the the, the heavy labor kind of things, whereas women did more the things that would not require as much strength, but a woman still had to be there. Thinking back 100 years, what did a woman have to do? Well, number one, she had her own garden. She had to sew her own clothes most of the time. And she had to preserve all the foods that she used in the winter. So she had to um, can, okay? Um, she had to not just take care of the children. There were so many more things. Washing clothes was an all day ordeal. I remember my mom. She did not have a washing machine when I was a little kid, or even when I was a teenager. I think maybe when I was a teenager we got, or late teenager when we got our first washing machine. Um, my mom had to wash by hand. She had to soak the clothes in the evening, the heavy soiled clothes in the evening, and in the morning she started washing, and she was in the washing um, kitchen all day long. And the next day, well, she had to continue. She had to take the clothes off from the hangers again because hopefully it was dry. That was an ordeal to, dry clothes when it was raining. She had to take it up in the attic, hang it up, and then bring it down from the attic again. Um, and then, of course, she had to iron everything. That took almost another day, or at least half a day, or several evenings. So women had a lot of work to do to support the family. It was not just the man, okay? I know my mom had to work alongside my dad in many areas. Wooded, in the garden. Um, she had her own garden. We had times when we actually grew all of our potatoes, and I remember my mother and my grandmother and my aunt being out there weeding the potatoes and then getting the potatoes and harvesting the potatoes. There was a time when my family even grew their own wheat for flour. And my mom and my grandmother was totally involved in that and making the hay for the cows. I know my mom and my grandmother was out there in the field um, turning around, the grass for drying. We didn't have machines in those days. It had to be done by hand. Okay, my mom was out there helping. My grandma was out there helping. So, this thing that, well, women could just stay home and eat bonbons, that is totally something that is very foreign to me. And I also remember learning that during the Industrial Revolution, in other words, where women or families moved into the city and the men had to work in the factories, I remember that women had to work in the factories too, or mothers. Matter of fact, even little kids. My mother started working in a factory when she was 15 years old because she had to help support the family. Um, and I know there was a time when there were no laws against um, children working in factories, and very young children, 10-year-old children, were used to work in a factory, and the family needed that income. And again, going back to the agrarian time, the boys and the girls worked alongside mom and dad very early. That's why today we still have the holiday, I mean, the vacation the way we have it, where we have 2.5 months off in the summer because the children were needed. Okay, the boys and the girls were needed to help with the farm or the ranch. Okay, so that is very important. We always have this understanding that, oh my goodness, it's so biblical that women stay at home and and just do the kitchen and or whatever. I have not been raised that way, and really, a lot of uh, let's say women my age um, still can remember that the mothers had to do all kinds of things to help support the family. It wasn't just, oh, the man would go out and make the money and the woman would stay home and just take care of the kids. That didn't even exist. And yet women today think that's their only job. They sit at home and put their, clothes in the washer or the dishes, in the dishwasher, and buy the clothes. They don't even have to knit anymore, or fix any of the clothes, which was the case, still, I sewed my own clothes. And so I know my parents, um, my mother, we sewed all our clothes. I very seldom had any clothes that was bought. Um, so it was a very different time. And I've not had the luxury to believe that a woman is not working alongside the husband in supporting the family. Yes, my dad worked much harder than my mom, but then again, uh, it was because my dad had a lot more strength than my mom, but my mom did the same kind of work, um, according to her abilities. So I am extremely against these people that want to tell me that women do not have an equal role in marriage when it comes to providing. Now, I will continue next time to show very clearly that the role of the man and the woman, or the husband and the wife, are really the same. They are not different. They may Husband and wife may express these roles in different ways. However, I will show clearly next time that the role of the man and the woman is the same. Okay? Now, of course, the man does not bear children. Okay? But he makes them. And because he makes them, he is responsible. Okay? So I can't just say, oh, the woman has the role of bearing children. That is not right. Yeah, she is the only one who can bear the children. However, once the child is there, there is no reason why the husband shouldn't be part of uh, raising these children. And again, in the past, that was not the case. See, during the Industrial Revolution, or kind of later, like let's say 1945 is a good point. After the Second World War, women finally didn't have to go working anymore. The United States was at a point where they were so rich and successful that women had the opportunity to stay at home. And the men were the only ones that went out every morning and had a job that provided money. And so women stayed at home during that time, during the 40s and 50s, late 40s and 50s and 60s, and took care of the children. However, that was very different than how it was, let's say, in the 30s or before the 30s. That's when a lot of men were still having um, their businesses at home. And so the men and the women, or the husband and the wife, they work side by side. Okay, like for instance, on a farm or on a ranch, the women and the men, they work side by side. And because the men were kind of at home, they also had part in raising the children. Very early on, the children learned to be trained in the things that the man and the woman were doing, the husband and the wife were doing. Like for instance, on a farm, the children learned very early to take care of the animals, or to drive a tractor, or to pick up things. The dad was kind of depending on her helper. And so once these little ones came along, they had to pick up their little chores and jobs. And so all these roles kind of changed with the Industrial Revolution, that families kind of were torn apart. They were not together anymore like they used to be. And So that was a very difficult time for the family because the dad was not around. And again, in the beginning, women and children had to work in the factories to make ends meet. Um, so then we go on into, like I said, 60s, and what do we see on TV? Oh, we see these typical TV um, families where the women didn't have to work. They had their pearls on and their little aprons, and like Leave It to Beaver, um, and other TV shows, where the mom really, I mean, she was just not uh, really involved with with the husband anymore. So that is very important to see that really television shaped that thinking about the role of the husband and wife very much. And I think that's something very important to mention. Look at these old shows from the 60s, from the 50s, from the 60s, and see how the role of the woman was seen. Matter of fact, that was not biblical. That was cultural. Okay, it was nothing but cultural. And so then we come to the 60s, the end of the 60s and the early 70s, where women finally said, you know what, I had enough of this little game here, that I'm stuck in the house with kids, and I want to be out there too, and at least don't have to talk to 2-year-olds all day long. And so this change kind of happened, and that a lot of Christian men did not like that. Okay, well, because finding or eventually they lost control. They lost control of their wives. They lost control in the family. However, it wasn't replaced by something new. By something new that means maybe equality. That hey, we need to sit together and discuss things. That kind of took a while to come into place. And eventually, I think we are doing that. However, there are still just too many Christians that insist that this cultural belief about what a family ought to look like needs to continue. Okay, this traditional view needs to continue. Well, guess what? Again, next time I will show a better way. I want to say a better way. A better way that is really considering what Jesus wants us, or how Jesus wants us to relate. So I will finish up today um, and kind of finish up with this historical thing. But I wanted to really think about this and think about what role media like TV had in shaping this idea of what the ideal family or marriage looks like. Again, I'm reminding you of Leave It to Beaver and all these other TV shows out of the 50s and 60s or early 60s, and see how that kind of got ingrained in our brain to believe that that's the biblical model of how marriage ought to look like. The biblical model cannot look like our model today because, again, in Bible times, the man and the woman were at home. Okay, the man was not out there someplace doing his own thing. It just didn't happen. Um, Men and the women had to work together. Men and women had to work in the field together. Men and women had to do lots of things together. So, and this whole idea, this new idea, is just totally unbiblical. I think if anything is unbiblical, is the way the Industrial Revolution kind of shaped our idea about who's going out getting the money and who's staying home spending the money. That's, I think, the only thing that is very unbiblical. So, anyways, again, think about these things. Um, and next time, I will finally get to the real crux of what the marriage ought to look like. And I'm not saying that God is telling us that. I'm just saying when we look at the Bible, um, how does God want us to relate to one another? That's all. I think God gave us lots of flexibility in how we structure marriage. Again, the survival of marriage depends on flexibility. The survival of humankind depends on flexibility. And if we're not flexible, then humankind will uh, perish. We have to be flexible. Again, I'm going back to my parents. My mother grew up after the Second World War and without a dad who was killed in the Second World War. And her mom had 4 children, and she had to go, very early on, she had to go to work to support the family. And not only that, her mother, she had almost her own agriculture to take care of. She had her own cow that she has to take care of, or sometimes 2 cows, and field. But we grew our own food practically. When I grew up, we grew our own food, and my mom did too when she, grew up. And they had to go in the field and do everything. Not just my grandmother, but the children had to be out there growing their own food. And if they would have not done it, um, they could have not survived. My grandmother made all the clothes, from sewing to knitting to crocheting. She made everything, and she taught my mother the same thing. And when I grew up, that's what we still did. Um, so that's what life looks like in reality, and not in fantasy or in the movies. In reality, women had to work, women had to support themselves. And I am so thankful that 100 years ago, we actually became equal in the eyes of society. Yes, it took a long time to change things around, but I'm sure glad I am not living in 1500 like Luther did, and his wife Katharina, who had to get married. Luckily she found like a good man like Luther, but so many women didn't were not that lucky. And so I am thankful today that we have this equal rights thing. Okay, I'm very concerned, and I already said that, about raising children. When we have young children, I think women should really consider, I'm saying consider, staying home for at least the first 3 years. I don't believe that women have to stay home all the time. And again, there's many circumstances where women have to go back to work. I understand that. I'm talking about ideal. I'm not talking about a must. Never ever talk about must. So again, I will finish up today, and I will talk some more next time.